January 1945. A cold morning settles over a small town along the western edge of Germany, not far from the Rhine. Snow rests in thin patches between shattered bricks and collapsed roofs. Windows stand open to the winter air, their glass long gone, replaced by cloth or wooden boards. Smoke rises weakly from improvised stoves burning scraps of furniture. Along a narrow street, a line of women forms quietly. Most carry small bags or dinner pots. They wait without speaking, their breath visible in the freezing air. For years, ration cards had dictated survival. Grams of bread, thin soup, substitutes stretched beyond recognition. Hunger had become routine, almost predictable. Then the sound arrives first. Engines. Heavy, steady, unfamiliar. American trucks roll into the square, large olive vehicles coated in mud from distant roads. Soldiers climb down and begin unloading wooden crates, dozens of them. Metal cans clatter. Sacks of flour follow. Boxes marked with English words no one nearby can read. The women watch in silence. There is too much food, far too much for a single day. And in that moment, confusion replaces hunger, because what they are seeing does not match anything they have known for years, a realization that begins long before anyone understands how such abundance was even possible. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Germany entered the conflict already shaped by memory. The hunger of the First World War still lingered deeply in the national psyche. During that earlier conflict, Allied naval blockades had caused widespread food shortages, and German planners were determined never to allow starvation to weaken the country again. From the first days of Nazi rule, food supply became a matter not only of economics, but of strategy. The German state reorganized agriculture under strict control. Production quotas were introduced. Farmers reported yields directly to authorities. Imports were carefully calculated, and rationing systems were designed even before large-scale fighting began. By the winter of 1939, ration cards governed daily life. Bread, meat, butter, sugar, and clothing were distributed according to category. Soldiers and industrial workers receiving priority, civilians adjusting to limitation. At first, the system appeared successful. Early military victories brought resources from occupied territories. Grain from Eastern Europe, livestock from Western farms, and forced laborers helped maintain German consumption levels. Urban populations continued functioning, and propaganda reinforced the idea that Germany had solved the food problems that had destroyed morale in 1918. But beneath the appearance of stability, the system depended entirely on expansion. As the war widened, Germany's agricultural workforce shrank. Millions of men were drafted into the Wehrmacht, leaving farms increasingly dependent on prisoners of war and coerced laborers from occupied countries. Machinery wore down faster than it could be replaced. Fertilizer production declined as industrial resources shifted toward weapons manufacturing. Each harvest became slightly smaller, though official messaging rarely admitted it. By 1942 and 1943, the strain began to show clearly. Allied bombing campaigns targeted industrial regions and, increasingly, transportation networks. Rail yards, canals, bridges, and fuel depots were struck repeatedly. Food still existed in parts of the countryside, but moving it safely into cities became dangerous and unreliable. Trains arrived late or not at all. Refrigerated storage facilities were destroyed. Warehouses burned. For civilians, shortages appeared gradually rather than suddenly. Meat portions shrank first. Coffee disappeared and was replaced with substitutes made from roasted grains. Butter gave way to margarine, then to thinner replacements. Bread contained increasing amounts of filler, potatoes, beet fiber, or other extenders designed to stretch limited flour supplies. Women bore the greatest responsibility for managing these changes. With husbands, fathers, and sons at the front, German women became organizers of survival. They stood in ration lines before dawn, negotiated with shopkeepers, repaired clothing repeatedly, and learned to transform minimal ingredients into meals that could sustain families through long winters. Cookbooks adapted to scarcity, offering recipes that required almost nothing. Kitchens became spaces of calculation rather than comfort. The war entered homes not through gunfire, but through absence, empty shelves, smaller meals, and uncertainty about tomorrow's distribution. Air raids intensified this pressure. By 1943, cities such as Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin experienced devastating bombing campaigns. Residential districts burned, food depots vanished, and municipal services struggled to function. Even when ration allocations existed on paper, physical access to food became unpredictable. Civilians sometimes traveled hours to exchange ration coupons, only to find supplies exhausted. Fuel shortages worsened conditions further. Without coal deliveries, bakeries closed intermittently. Public transportation slowed, preventing workers from reaching markets. Winter became especially dangerous, as heating and cooking competed for the same scarce resources. By late 1944, Germany's logistical system was nearing collapse. The Allied advance from both west and east severed major transport corridors. Agricultural regions were cut off from industrial cities. Military needs consumed remaining reserves, leaving civilians increasingly dependent on emergency distributions that grew smaller each month. Malnutrition spread quietly. Official records rarely used the word starvation, but weight loss, fatigue, and illness became common realities. Children grew thinner. Elderly populations suffered most severely. Markets operated under strict supervision, yet black markets expanded wherever official supply failed. Still, many civilians believed shortages were temporary, a hardship shared equally across nations at war. Propaganda reinforced the idea that enemies suffered just as much, if not more. Few imagined that elsewhere, across the Atlantic Ocean, an entirely different economic reality had emerged, one capable of producing food not merely for survival, but in quantities beyond European comprehension. And as Germany entered the final winter of the war, the contrast between expectation and reality was about to become impossible to ignore, a contrast shaped not only by battlefield victories, but by something less visible and far more decisive: logistics. While Germany struggled to maintain a shrinking supply network across a collapsing continent, another system was expanding on a scale the world had never seen before. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States fought a different kind of battle, one measured not only in divisions or ships, but in production lines, shipping schedules, and mathematical precision. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its mainland industry stood untouched by bombing or invasion. Factories operated with access to vast natural resources. American farmland produced surplus grain, livestock, and dairy in quantities already exceeding domestic consumption. The challenge was not production itself, but organization, transforming civilian abundance into a global military supply system. The solution emerged through coordination between government agencies, private industry, and the military's logistical branches, particularly the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Their task extended beyond feeding soldiers. They were responsible for clothing, fuel, medical supplies, shelter materials, and above all, food, delivered reliably across oceans controlled by enemy submarines. American agriculture underwent rapid mechanization. Tractors replaced manual labor at unprecedented speed. Fertilizer production expanded. Women and migrant workers filled labor shortages created by military enlistment. Scientific farming methods increased yields even as millions served overseas. By 1943, American farms were producing enough food to sustain not only U.S. forces, but allied nations dependent on imported supplies. Industrial food processing became a strategic weapon. Canning factories operated continuously, producing meats, vegetables, powdered eggs, dehydrated potatoes, and condensed milk designed specifically for long transport and extended storage. Refrigeration technology improved preservation during shipment. Standardized packaging allowed supplies to be counted, stacked, and distributed efficiently under combat conditions. Equally important was transportation. American shipyards produced Liberty ships at astonishing speed, cargo vessels designed for rapid construction rather than elegance. At the height of production, a new ship could be completed in weeks. Thousands crossed the Atlantic in convoy formations protected by naval escorts, carrying everything from ammunition to flour sacks. Losses to German U-boats, once devastating, declined as Allied anti-submarine tactics improved. Once supplies reached Europe, another challenge began, moving them inland fast enough to sustain advancing armies. After the Normandy landings in June 1944, Allied forces advanced more quickly than planners anticipated. Ports were damaged or heavily defended, railways destroyed, and infrastructure unreliable. To solve the problem, the U.S. Army created one of the most famous logistical operations of the war, the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks operated almost continuously, driven largely by African-American soldiers, transporting fuel and supplies from coastal depots to frontline units across France. Convoys moved day and night, headlights dimmed, engines rarely stopping. Roads became flowing arteries of cargo, ensuring that advancing forces never outran their provisions. This system produced a remarkable outcome. American soldiers were rarely without food. Even during intense campaigns, rations remained consistent. Field kitchens could prepare hot meals close to combat zones. Standardized ration packs, including K rations and C rations, provided calories, vitamins, and variety designed to maintain morale as well as physical strength. Abundance was not accidental. It was calculated. Military planners understood that well-fed troops fought more effectively, recovered faster, and maintained psychological resilience. Logistics, therefore, became inseparable from strategy. Victory depended not only on defeating enemy armies, but on sustaining momentum longer than opponents could endure. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed into Germany itself, this logistical system continued operating at full capacity. Ships still arrived daily. Warehouses filled faster than they emptied. Replacement supplies followed predictable schedules supported by industrial output thousands of miles away. For American soldiers, this reliability became normal, expected, even unnoticed. For German civilians emerging from years of rationing, bombing, and scarcity, however, the arrival of such a system would appear almost unreal. They were witnessing not simply the army of another nation, but the physical expression of an economy untouched by war's destruction. And as American supply columns rolled deeper into German towns, the difference between two wartime systems, one exhausted, the other overflowing, began to reveal itself not through speeches or propaganda, but through something far simpler: food placed directly into waiting hands. Angle 1. The human perspective. Women as managers of survival. Inside German homes, food had long ceased to represent comfort. It had become arithmetic. For years, women calculated meals according to ration coupons measured in grams rather than portions. Official weekly allocations often required stretching ingredients beyond recognition. Soup bases were reused repeatedly. Bread was preserved carefully to prevent waste. Even vegetable scraps held value. Cooking demanded improvisation, shaped by shortage rather than choice. By 1944, many households operated on what historians describe as substitution diets. Coffee contained no coffee. Meat appeared rarely. Fats, essential for calories during cold winters, were among the most limited items. Mothers often reduced their own portions to feed children first, a quiet pattern repeated across cities and villages alike. The emotional effect of prolonged scarcity changed expectations. Hunger did not always appear dramatic. Instead, it became normalized. Civilians adapted psychologically, lowering assumptions about what daily life could provide. A full meal no longer seemed realistic. When American forces arrived carrying large quantities of packaged food, the reaction was therefore not immediate celebration. It was hesitation. Many civilians assumed supplies were temporary or reserved only for soldiers. Some expected strict limits similar to German distribution systems. Women standing near American field kitchens watched carefully, not simply observing food itself, but the scale at which it appeared. Crates continued unloading long after needs seemed satisfied. Cooking equipment produced meals faster than lines could form. The unfamiliar abundance conflicted with years of learned restraint. For individuals trained by hardship to expect less, abundance required time to understand. Angle 2, the logistics perspective, feeding an army larger than nations. From a military standpoint, what German civilians witnessed was the visible edge of a logistical structure designed for global warfare. American planners calculated food requirements scientifically. Each soldier required thousands of calories daily, depending on activity level, climate, and operational intensity. Nutritionists worked alongside logisticians to balance proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, and fats. Food supply became standardized, predictable, and measurable. The same system that fed millions of soldiers also produced surplus capacity. Supply chains were intentionally built with redundancy. Extra shipments accounted for delays, losses, or unexpected offensives. Warehouses maintained reserves beyond immediate consumption to prevent shortages during rapid advances. As Allied armies pushed into Germany, these reserves followed closely behind. Supply depots established near captured territory often contained weeks of provisions. When combat slowed or front lines stabilized, excess food could be redirected toward displaced persons, prisoners of war, or civilians under occupation policies. To American officers, distributing food locally was practical. Well-fed populations reduced unrest, stabilized regions, and minimized disease outbreaks that could threaten troops. Feeding civilians, therefore, served both humanitarian and strategic purposes. But for observers unfamiliar with industrial-scale logistics, the steady arrival of trucks suggested something else entirely, an endless source with no visible limit. Angle 3, the industrial angle, food as manufactured power. The true foundation of American abundance lay far from Europe, inside factories and farms operating thousands of kilometers away. Unlike traditional wartime economies focused solely on weapons, the United States integrated food production into industrial planning. Processing plants transformed agricultural output into standardized goods designed for durability and transport. Canned meat, powdered milk, dehydrated vegetables, and preserved fruit allowed enormous quantities of nutrition to move safely across oceans. Mass production removed uncertainty. A crate packed in Chicago or Kansas followed identical specifications to one packed weeks later. Labels, measurements, and packaging simplified distribution regardless of language or location. Even cooking methods were standardized so field kitchens could prepare meals efficiently under varying conditions. Refrigeration trucks and insulated containers extended freshness. Advances in preservation meant food could remain usable for months without spoilage, a revolutionary advantage compared to traditional European supply chains dependent on local harvest cycles. For German civilians accustomed to seasonal scarcity, this industrial relationship with food seemed almost mechanical. Supplies arrived independent of weather, harvest, or local production. The connection between farmland and dinner table, once immediate and visible, had been replaced by a distant, invisible network powered by factories and ships. The result was psychological as much as physical. Food no longer appeared tied to effort or local survival. It arrived continuously, detached from hardship. And as civilians began to recognize that American soldiers themselves treated this abundance as ordinary rather than exceptional, a deeper realization slowly emerged. The difference they were witnessing was not temporary generosity, but the product of an entirely different economic world. That realization would become even clearer when viewed from the perspectives of the soldiers distributing the food, the psychological reactions it created, and the broader moral intentions behind occupation policy. Angle 4, the soldier's perspective, normalcy in abundance. For American soldiers entering Germany in 1945, the food surrounding them felt unremarkable. Most had trained and fought within a system where regular meals were expected even under difficult conditions. Field kitchens followed advancing units whenever terrain allowed. Coffee was brewed daily. Hot meals appeared whenever operational pauses permitted. Standard rations reflected careful planning. K-rations provided portable nutrition during combat operations, while larger C-rations and field kitchens offered greater variety once position stabilized. Soldiers complained about monotony at times, but rarely about quantity. Compared to earlier wars, consistent feeding represented one of the U.S. Army's major achievements. Many soldiers came from rural or working-class American backgrounds where food availability, even during the Great Depression, had generally remained higher than wartime Europe. As a result, they often underestimated how severe German shortages had become. Offering a spare chocolate bar or extra bread felt like a small gesture rather than a significant act. Yet soldiers quickly noticed civilian reactions. Children stared at ration tins as if they were rare objects. Adults accepted food cautiously, sometimes hesitating before eating. Interpreters recorded moments when civilians asked whether distribution would stop the next day, assuming supplies must soon run out. To American troops, the question seemed strange. The supply trucks arrived every day. More ships were already crossing the Atlantic. Within the military mindset, continuity was assumed. This difference in expectation quietly reshaped interactions between occupiers and civilians. Angle 5, Psychological Shock. Encountering an unfamiliar reality. Hunger affects perception as much as the body. After prolonged deprivation, individuals adapt mentally to limits. Sociologists studying wartime Europe later noted that scarcity narrows imagination. People plan only for immediate needs because long-term certainty disappears. German civilians had lived within such conditions for years. Bombing, evacuation, and ration reductions reinforced the idea that resources were finite and constantly shrinking. Even rumors of shortages influenced behavior, encouraging saving and restraint. The American presence disrupted this psychological framework. Food appeared not as isolated relief, but as repetition. Trucks returned the next day and the day after. Field kitchens continued operating. Supplies did not diminish visibly. Instead of queues growing longer due to scarcity, distribution became more orderly as availability stabilized. Observers described confusion before gratitude. Civilians attempted to understand the source of supply. Was it captured German stock? Emergency aid? Temporary generosity before strict occupation rules began? Only gradually did realization emerge that the flow originated from outside Europe entirely, from a country whose farmland and factories had never experienced bombardment. Abundance, once interpreted as impossible, became observable reality. This shift altered emotional responses. Fear softened into cautious trust. Children approached soldiers more freely. Conversations began through gestures, food exchanges, and shared routines rather than ideology. Food functioned as silent communication, conveying stability without words. Angle 6, the moral and strategic dimension. Feeding as occupation policy. American distribution of food was not random charity. It formed part of broader occupation planning shaped by lessons learned earlier in the war. Military authorities understood that starving populations created instability. Malnutrition increased disease risk, encouraged black markets, and fueled resentment capable of prolonging resistance. Feeding civilians, therefore, served strategic goals, maintaining order, preventing humanitarian disaster, and encouraging cooperation during Reconstruction. Policies evolved during 1945 as Allied leadership balanced punishment of the Nazi regime with responsibility towards civilian populations. Initial directives emphasized strict control, but conditions on the ground forced adjustment. Reports from medical officers warned of rising malnutrition levels, particularly among children and the elderly. Food assistance programs expanded accordingly. Army kitchens sometimes provided surplus meals. Relief organizations coordinated deliveries. Displaced persons camps received structured supply allocations designed to prevent famine across occupied regions. Importantly, These efforts also reshaped perception. German civilians who had experienced years of propaganda, portraying Americans as destructive enemies, encountered soldiers distributing bread and medical aid instead. The contrast undermined wartime narratives more effectively than political messaging. Historians later argued that logistical generosity helped stabilize occupied Germany faster than anticipated. While resentment and hardship remained, consistent food distribution reduced desperation, a crucial factor in preventing widespread unrest during the fragile transition from war to peace. Through this lens, abundance became more than material supply. It represented policy, strategy, and psychological reconstruction operating simultaneously. And as these interactions multiplied across towns and cities, a decisive moment approached, when the scale and permanence of American supply would become undeniable, transforming confusion into a broader understanding that the war had not only been won on battlefields, but through the sustained power of production itself. March 1945. Along the western banks of the Rhine River, the war in Europe entered its final phase. German defenses, once organized around coordinated withdrawals and counterattacks, were fragmenting under continuous pressure from Allied advances. Cities lay damaged, transportation networks severed, and civilian administration struggled to function. In many towns, authorities shifted almost overnight as American units crossed into territory that had been isolated from reliable supply for months. The military objective was clear: push eastward quickly, secure crossings, and prevent German forces from reorganizing. Yet behind armored divisions and infantry columns came something equally decisive: long lines of transport vehicles carrying fuel, ammunition, medical equipment, and food. The first signs appeared at temporary depots established near captured rail junctions and open fields. Engineers marked unloading zones while quartermaster units organized inventories with practiced efficiency. Within hours of arrival, stacks of crates formed ordered rows: canned meat, flour sacks, powdered milk, dehydrated vegetables, coffee, sugar, and medical rations. To American planners, this sequence followed established procedure. Supply always followed advance. Combat success depended on it. But for nearby civilians, the scale felt extraordinary. German towns, emerging from weeks of disrupted deliveries, had grown accustomed to uncertainty. Bakeries operated sporadically. Local officials rationed remaining reserves carefully, often reducing portions to extend survival. Rumors of famine circulated widely during the winter of 1944-45, especially in regions cut off by damaged rail lines. When American supply columns entered these areas, the contrast became immediately visible. Trucks arrived not individually, but in convoys. Each vehicle carried standardized cargo, and unloading continued long after immediate military needs appeared satisfied. Field kitchens were among the first facilities assembled. Large metal cooking units unfolded beside vehicles, fueled by portable burners capable of preparing hundreds of meals at once. Steam rose into cold air as soups and stews were prepared according to measured recipes designed for efficiency and nutrition. At first, civilians observed from a distance. Occupation regulations limited movement, and uncertainty remained high. Many feared punishment or displacement. Yet hunger gradually overcame hesitation. Local authorities, often working through interpreters, began organizing controlled distributions for displaced persons, children, and the elderly. The moment marked a quiet turning point. Lines formed again, but unlike earlier ration queues, these moved steadily. Ladles filled containers generously. Bread portions appeared thicker than expected. Some distributions included unfamiliar items: canned fruit, chocolate, chewing gum, powdered drinks mixed with clean water supplied by military purification units. Witness accounts recorded repeated reactions of disbelief. Civilians asked whether quantities would be reduced the following day. Some attempted to save portions immediately, assuming shortages would return. Others hesitated to accept more than minimal amounts, conditioned by years of scarcity. Meanwhile, supply trucks continued arriving. The logistical rhythm never stopped. Roads leading west filled with vehicles traveling in organized intervals, guided by military police managing traffic flow. Repair units fixed bridges quickly enough to maintain movement. Portable depots expanded as territory secured behind advancing forces grew larger. Statistics later revealed the scale behind what civilians saw. Allied armies in Europe consumed thousands of tons of supplies daily. Feeding soldiers required enormous planning, but production levels ensured surplus capacity remained available once combat intensity decreased in a region. In several towns along the Rhine and in southern Germany, American commanders authorized expanded feeding operations when medical officers reported civilian malnutrition. Army rations supplemented local food stocks until normal distribution systems could be restored. 4 German women responsible for households. This moment carried particular weight. Years of careful planning around absence suddenly collided with visible plenty. Kitchens that had operated on minimal ingredients now received foods rarely seen since early wartime years. White flour, preserved meat, sugar, fats essential for cooking. The emotional reaction was rarely dramatic. Instead, observers described quiet astonishment. Conversations lowered to whispers. People counted crates, attempting to estimate how long supplies might last. What they could not yet see was the larger truth. The flow behind those trucks extended across an ocean, supported by factories and farms still operating at full strength. The convoy arriving today was already being replaced by another preparing to depart weeks earlier from distant American ports. As spring advanced and Allied control expanded deeper into Germany, the temporary appearance of abundance began transforming into something more permanent. A realization that this supply was not an emergency measure, but part of an ongoing system designed to continue indefinitely. And it was during this realization, as days passed and deliveries never ceased, that the true psychological turning point began to unfold. By April 1945, the war in Germany was no longer defined solely by combat. In many regions west of the Elbe River and throughout Bavaria and the Rhineland, organized resistance weakened as Allied forces secured towns faster than German command structures could respond. For civilians, daily life shifted from survival under bombardment to uncertainty under occupation, and within that transition, a quieter transformation unfolded. The supply trucks did not stop coming. At first, many civilians assumed American distributions were temporary measures connected to active military operations. Wartime experience had taught them that resources appeared briefly and then disappeared. Yet days turned into weeks, and the pattern remained unchanged. Each morning brought movement along roads once silent. Engines approaching, unloading crews working methodically, inventories recorded with precision. Food did not diminish. Local officials, often supervised by Allied military government units, began organizing structured distribution schedules. Schools reopened partially, sometimes supported by meal programs for children whose nutrition levels had fallen dangerously low during the final winter of war. Hospitals received medical rations alongside food shipments, stabilizing patients weakened by malnutrition. 4 German women managing households. The repetition created a new and unfamiliar problem: planning beyond tomorrow. For years, cooking decisions have been shaped by uncertainty. Meals depended on what could be obtained that day, not what might exist next week. Now supplies appeared predictable. Flour deliveries allowed baking again. Cooking fats returned gradually to kitchens. Sugar, once reserved for rare occasions, became accessible in small but reliable quantities. The psychological adjustment proved slower than the physical recovery. Many civilians continued saving portions instinctively, hiding food despite consistent availability. Diaries and post-war testimonies describe hesitation, an inability to trust abundance after prolonged deprivation. Some fear that accepting too much might violate rules not yet understood. Others suspected hidden motives behind generosity, shaped by years of propaganda warning of enemy deception. American soldiers noticed these reactions. Reports from occupation authorities described civilians declining second servings or asking repeatedly whether supplies would soon end. Interpreters explained that shipments were ongoing, supported by resources far outside Germany's borders. Gradually, understanding spread through observation rather than explanation. Rail lines repaired by Allied engineers began operating again, carrying freight west to east. Convoys continued regardless of weather conditions. Warehouses filled and emptied in organized cycles. The logistical system revealed itself as stable, almost routine. Statistics reinforced this reality. American forces in Europe operated within a supply network capable of sustaining millions daily. Even after accounting for military consumption, production levels allowed assistance programs to expand without threatening troop readiness. Food shipments arrived faster than they could be exhausted. For civilians accustomed to scarcity economics, this contradicted lived experience. In wartime Germany, increased demand meant immediate shortage. Under the American system, demand triggered additional supply. The difference represented more than wealth. It reflected industrial scale and geographic security. American farmland had remained intact. Factories operated continuously. Transportation networks expanded rather than contracted during the war. What Germans interpreted as endless supply was, in fact, the predictable output of a vast economic system mobilized for total war. The realization altered emotional dynamics within occupied regions. Fear of starvation began to fade. Black markets, once essential for survival, lost some urgency as official distribution stabilized. Children gained weight slowly. Public spaces reopened cautiously as energy returned to communities weakened by years of deprivation. Equally significant was the symbolic effect. Wartime propaganda had portrayed Allied bombing as evidence of destructive intent alone. Yet civilians now encountered soldiers delivering food and medical aid alongside military authority. The contradiction forced reassessment, not instantly, but gradually through daily experience. Food became proof of permanence. The war's outcome was no longer abstract or distant. It appeared in kitchens, bakeries, and school meals. Abundance signaled not merely victory, but a different future structure, one where survival no longer depended on improvisation or scarcity management. By the time Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, many civilians had already experienced this turning point privately. The decisive moment was not a single announcement or battle, but the quiet recognition that supply would continue tomorrow and the day after. And with that realization came the beginning of a new phase, one defined not by conquest, but by reconstruction, as the consequences of sustained abundance reshaped both German society and Allied strategy in the uncertain months that followed. By late May 1945, Germany lay formally defeated, its political structures collapsed, its cities scarred by years of bombardment. Yet amidst the ruins, a quieter story of survival was emerging, one told not through tanks or gunfire, but through bread, milk, and steady supply. The arrival of American food in previously isolated towns prevented what historians later described as a looming humanitarian crisis. The most immediate consequence was a rapid reduction in famine risk. Malnutrition among civilians had reached alarming levels by early 1945, particularly among children and the elderly. In the Ruhr, Bavaria, and parts of Saxony, hospitals reported increases in weight loss, vitamin deficiencies, and illness caused by prolonged food scarcity. German authorities, stripped of administrative capacity and transportation resources, could no longer coordinate meaningful relief. Without Allied intervention, starvation was likely in multiple urban centers. American occupation forces responded swiftly. Quartermaster units redirected portions of military rations to civilian populations. Field kitchens expanded service beyond soldiers, establishing regular feeding points in towns and villages. Trucks delivered flour, sugar, canned meats, and powdered milk, allowing kitchens to resume operations. Medical officers coordinated with supply teams to provide nutritionally balanced meals for vulnerable groups. Even in small villages, a pattern emerged. Daily distributions became reliable, and civilians could plan meals in advance for the first time in years. Public behavior adjusted to this stability. Lines for rations, once frantic and tense, moved methodically. Black market activity declined slightly, though it did not vanish entirely. Women managing households began organizing meals based on predictable deliveries rather than improvising from scraps. Communities reopened partially. Bakeries began baking larger loaves, schools organized small meal programs, and hospitals could feed patients adequately. For many civilians, these routines became the first tangible sign of normalcy since the war had intensified in 1943. Occupying forces noted that psychological effects matched the physical benefits. Reports from field officers described civilians initially hesitant to accept full rations, often distributing portions to neighbors or holding back from taking more than a minimum. Over weeks, trust developed. Children approached feeding points eagerly, parents relaxed cautiously, and towns adjusted to the new rhythm. Where scarcity had previously defined daily life, abundance began shaping expectations. In addition to preventing famine, supply operations also served a strategic role. Stabilizing civilian populations reduced the likelihood of unrest, looting, or resistance, which could have threatened advancing military units. Well-fed communities provided more cooperative environments for reconstruction efforts. Occupation authorities recognized that immediate food relief would lay the foundation for longer-term recovery and political stability, particularly in regions previously controlled by Nazi officials who had maintained strict rationing and propaganda. By the end of the first month of sustained distributions, the scale of the intervention was clear. Thousands of tons of food had reached civilian populations. Hospitals were functioning at higher capacity. Schools offered midday meals for children, often for the first time since the early years of the war. Women, previously constrained by scarcity and fear, began regaining control over domestic life, managing kitchens with planning and foresight rather than desperation. The contrast with the final years of German wartime scarcity could not have been more stark. Where ration lines once reflected limitation, queues now reflected reliability. Where cupboards had remained mostly empty, shelves now held predictable quantities of food. German civilians began to grasp a simple, yet profound, truth. The flow of supplies was not an anomaly. It was continuous, structured, and backed by resources far beyond their experience. And as civilians gradually accepted this new reality, the stage was set for the long-term reconstruction that would follow. Recovery would take years, but the immediate crisis, widespread hunger and potential famine, had been averted by the convergence of military efficiency, industrial capacity, and deliberate humanitarian policy. These outcomes, though quiet compared to battlefield victories, proved as decisive in shaping post-war life as the cessation of combat itself. As 1945 progressed into summer, the immediate relief of daily food supplies evolved into broader consequences that shaped Germany's post-war recovery. The sustained arrival of American provisions did more than prevent starvation. It altered social behavior, stabilized communities, and influenced the political and economic restructuring that would define the occupation period. One of the most significant long-term effects was psychological stabilization. Years of deprivation had created a population conditioned to scarcity. Adults hoarded supplies, children accepted thin meals as the norm, and households operated with constant anxiety over tomorrow's rations. When American food continued to arrive reliably, these patterns began to shift. Families learned to plan meals with consistency. Women regained confidence in managing kitchens without improvising from scraps. Children's health improved, providing the first opportunity for proper growth since the winter of 1944. For many civilians, this consistency fostered trust in authority, a remarkable shift in a society accustomed to ration cards and unpredictable deliveries. The decline of the black market represented another notable effect. During the final years of the war, unauthorized trade had often been essential for survival, providing sugar, fats, and protein unavailable through official channels. Once American supply systems stabilized, black market prices fell, and much of the trade diminished. Civilians relied less on riskier transactions and more on organized distribution points, which further strengthened the perception of security and fairness under occupation. These food programs also supported broader Reconstruction efforts. Schools reopened with meal programs, allowing children to attend without the immediate concern of hunger. Hospitals, which had previously struggled to care for patients weakened by malnutrition, began functioning effectively. The reliability of supply freed women and local officials to participate in rebuilding infrastructure, clearing rubble, and restoring essential services. By ensuring that basic nutrition needs were met, American forces enabled other forms of recovery to proceed simultaneously. Politically, sustained provision contributed to a shift in perception of America and the Allies. Years of Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as invaders and destroyers. Yet civilians witnessed American soldiers distributing food, repairing infrastructure, and maintaining order. These interactions undermined hostile narratives, fostering a cautious respect that would influence public sentiment during the early occupation years. Historians note that this perception helped prevent large-scale unrest and facilitated smoother implementation of occupation policies, including denazification and administrative reform. Economically, the contrast between German scarcity and American industrial abundance reinforced the importance of industrial logistics in post-war policy. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, built on lessons observed in occupied Germany. A functioning economy required not only rebuilding factories and infrastructure, but ensuring access to basic needs for civilians. The immediate success of American food supply operations demonstrated the value of industrial capacity in stabilizing societies emerging from conflict, influencing Reconstruction strategies across Europe. Culturally, the experience left an enduring impression on women who had managed households during the war. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal repeated references to disbelief and astonishment at the scale and reliability of American supply. Women who had spent years stretching meager rations learned that organized, abundant logistics could prevent famine entirely. These memories shaped narratives of survival, resilience, and a first tangible experience of hope after years of deprivation. Finally, the sustained flow of food created a foundation for long-term health recovery. Malnutrition-related illnesses decreased. Children born during the final years of war began life with better nutrition than previous cohorts. Communities that had been on the brink of collapse found stability, allowing local economies to function and preparing the population for the slow but steady process of national rebuilding. Through these interrelated outcomes, the initial surprise and disbelief of German women evolved into understanding and, eventually, trust. The physical presence of food, once unimaginable, became a symbol of security and continuity, proof that abundance, unlike scarcity, could endure. In this way, American logistical planning did more than feed civilians. It shaped the social, political, and economic trajectory of post-war Germany. And as German society adjusted to this new reality, the human, industrial, and moral lessons of sustained abundance began to crystallize, leading naturally into reflection on what this event would mean for history, warfare, and humanity itself. The story of German women witnessing endless American food supplies is more than a tale of generosity or surprise. It is a lens through which the broader dynamics of industrial warfare, logistics, and human resilience can be understood. The contrast between scarcity and abundance, between years of rationing and daily deliveries of bread, meat, and sugar, reveals a truth that extends beyond any battlefield. War is fought as much through organization and infrastructure as through firepower. In this moment, civilians experienced firsthand the tangible power of American industrial capacity. Factories, farms, and transportation networks operating safely behind an ocean became instruments of strategy, shaping outcomes not only for soldiers, but for entire populations. The ability to sustain millions in combat zones, while simultaneously feeding civilians in occupied territories, reflects a level of planning and coordination unmatched in prior conflicts. For those who had endured the uncertainty of famine and the daily tension of ration lines, it must have appeared almost magical. A flow of sustenance untethered from local hardship, a visible proof that survival could be reliable, predictable, and sustained. Yet the story is also deeply human. German women, conditioned by years of deprivation, initially approached abundance with disbelief. Their reactions, hesitation, careful distribution, whispered astonishment, highlight the profound psychological impact of scarcity and the even greater effect of witnessing it reversed. Food, something so ordinary in peacetime, became an emblem of security, order, and hope in the shadow of destruction. This episode underscores a broader lesson of World War II. Victory extended beyond the battlefield. Industrial might, logistical foresight, and the capacity to project abundance became decisive tools. Civilians who saw supply as endless experienced not only relief, but a subtle transformation of perspective, learning that human needs could be met even after years of devastation. Ultimately, the sight of food flowing steadily into the hands of those who had endured hunger serves as a quiet testament to the power of planning, the resilience of communities, and the ways in which humanitarian logistics can shape the course of history as profoundly as combat itself.